Well, Michelle Grattan, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome back after the Easter break. All's pretty quiet in Australia on the political front at the moment. Obviously, the news at the moment is dominated by the release yesterday of the Commission of Audit report, and that's the topic of your Grattan on Friday piece in the conversation. I think you're pretty punchy in this article, if I may say so, Michelle. Picking up the timing issue first, they've released it within 2 weeks of the budget, but this means that there's a few days of speculation around. Was this a good political move to release it now?
Well, I should say that all the journalists, of course, have been calling for the release. So when I say that maybe it tactically wasn't all that sensible, it does go against our call for getting things out there. But from the government's point of view, I think to have this out at this point, especially as I think the government has really lost control of the pre-budget debate. Things are flying in all directions and most of it's bad for the government. So maybe it would have been better not to have a big debate about a very ambitious wish list, which is going to alarm a lot of voters.
But the alternative theory is that people were being softened up for worse so that the budget might actually seem almost a relief.
I think this is a bit over-sophisticated. That is a theory, but I think that the problem is that the government just has now too many things out there, both what it's planning to do and things that other people wanted to do. It's a really confused pre-budget debate.
And there's some restless backbenchers, not being named yet, but presumably they're nervous if they're in a marginal seat.
Well, they're agitated about a couple of things. They have been agitated about the paid parental leave scheme because that seems so much at odds with the more needs-based approach, the tougher approach, means testing and so on of the budget. Now, Tony Abbott has cut that back, but nevertheless it's still generous, and that's criticised in the Audit Commission report. But even more important, they're agitated about the prospect of tax going up, of this income tax rise for the better off. Now, this does seem at this point in the budget. The government argues everyone should bear some budget pain, and the only way for the richer people to bear budget pain is through the tax system. But this is a totally broken promise if it happens. And it's interesting that, of course, Julia Gillard, got such flack for breaking a promise on tax, the carbon tax promise. Here is Tony Abbott also breaking a promise on tax.
So let's develop that a little bit. Joe Hockey is saying that Labor's left such a mess that he may have no choice, but the so-called mess was laid out in the Charter of Budget Honesty by Treasury and Finance officials, and that was a whole system that Peter Costello brought in. So where are the big surprises for Joe Hockey that he could rely on?
I think that the government's strategy is to talk up a crisis, to talk up a storm and say, we have really got to fix this, and if we break the odd promise on the way through, well, that's justified by the bigger promise of fixing the problem. But as you say, really the government, the now government, had the budget numbers before the election, in the election campaign. Those are numbers that are untampered with by politicians. They're put out by the bureaucrats. Now, there are some assumptions in those numbers which were challenged by the coalition, and some things have happened since the election. There's been some deterioration in the budget. Part of that, in fact, has been the coalition making decisions to make the numbers worse. But yes, there has been something since. But in terms of what the government knew, the now government, it really knew the general picture, and I think that they're being somewhat dishonest in the way they're presenting things at the moment.
And then turning finally to the content, the core recommendations in the Commission of Audit report, you say that the report is a blueprint flawed in policy and political terms, and there are some shockers in there. And you cite Medicare as one of them. Can you elaborate on this?
Yes, I would make the point that it's not all bad. There are some sensible ideas, and some ideas that if they were modified to be less extreme would be sensible. But I think the attack on Medicare, which would essentially mean that only the very lower income groups would be left in Medicare, everybody else would be really forced into private insurance, this is a bad move. Australia has a good health system. It's had a good health system envied by other countries for many years. It is true that costs need to be contained. It's also true, I think, that the system could do with a small co-payment. But to effectively tear it down would be absolutely rash and just an ideological sort of play, if you like, rather than sensible policy. I think this is a very bad recommendation.
And then on the education front, bearing in mind the readership and the origins of the conversation, higher education, there's a proposal there that student contributions as a proportion of the total cost should rise from the current 41% on average to 55%. This would probably put Australia right at the top of OECD countries in terms of student contributions. Politically, however, do you think there's a problem for the government with this?
Well, if it adopted it, I think there would be some problem, as with many of these recommendations. But I think there's also a policy problem, that education is very important for Australia's future, to keep us competitive, to make us more competitive. I also think that it's not good that students come out of their years of education with excessive debt that they carry for a very long time. It's a question of balance in these days when education has become much more commercial than it used to be, but I do think that that recommendation takes things far too far.
Well, Michelle, interesting times. We'll talk again in a week, and I'm sure a lot will have happened before then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.